Okay, so some of you know me. I'm Al Shalloway, CEO of Success Engineering and founder. Used to be with Net Objectives. A lot of people know me from then, and 99 to 2019 when I sold my IP to the PMI. And then I left the PMI about a year ago, and I'm kind of just picking up, not quite where I was before. I didn't take any time off. My wife said, take some time off, Al. But what I did is I did a mental break to see what was needed. And I've done a little bit of a shift in a couple of ways, or maybe three ways. One is I've been working on remote training, and this will not be evidence of that to much extent. But I have come up with something I'd worked on for about 15 years on better ways of training, and it happens to be working well with live remote. So that's one thing. The other thing is I've been spending a lot more time on the structure uh, of how we present models. Frameworks are the big thing. Discipline Agile is not a framework, but I've taken what I was doing further into pattern languages and patterns. I probably won't talk about that much today. Um, and then the third thing is this whole idea of how to deal with complexity. We're in complex adaptive systems, no doubt, but personally, I totally disagree with a lot of the common approach that Scrum and some of the complexity theorists take. I'm not going to talk so much about that, but it runs through this workshop uh, a bit at the same time. Okay, so uh, basically, I did say this is going to be an hour and a half, but I'm actually planning on, why is this not switching? This is bizarre. Uh, okay, well, I'll do it. Let's go back to this. I'll do it this way. Okay. So by the way, I'm not using a PowerPoint. In fact, I'll zoom out and I'll show you what I'm doing. I'm using a Miro board. I do this for a few reasons. I do most of my presentations on Miro boards now, and it might look like PowerPoint, and yeah, I lose animation when I do this. But one of the advantages of doing this is it leaves a history of what's there and actually enables you all to uh, to participate at some level and ask questions. I'm actually going to copy the board link here where you can comment, and I'm going to put it in the chat. And if you please pay attention to me, but if you, oh, Al's boring, who wants to listen to him? You could go look in the chat, take this, and you could get on here. Um, and the reason is if you want to add comments now or later, that's perfectly fine. I am going to go through this, so I do suggest paying a little bit attention to what I'm saying. It'll be more clear. So more maybe after I do something, you can ask questions that way. My plan is to go through this in about 40 minutes, 45 minutes. I know we have an hour and a half specified, but I'd like to go through the material in 45 minutes, then just have a long time for Q&A. As questions come to you, though, we can discuss right then and there. But no, we are being recorded, and those questions will show up in the recording. I may cut them out, but I probably won't. Okay, so what I want to talk about is not just Scrum, actually. I want to talk about how do we do Agile, period. And I think Scrum is an example of not attending to a lot of things we really need to attend to. So I'm using Scrum as an example, but I could probably say this about most any of the Agile methods, including SAFe, which does talk a lot about first principles, which I will be talking about, but it does it in a way where it mentions them and then doesn't actually use them in the right way, which is kind of a little weird to me, but it does. So in a nutshell, we're going to be talking about really how to take Scrum and take what you're doing and get better. And we'll be using my Amplio approach. Amplio is improve in Latin. Uh, and I mean that at all levels. I continuously improve Amplio, and it's to help you improve, and then you work with people and how you improve your conveyance. So I'm going to talk a little bit about mindset, not most of it, but these are just different things I'm going to do. In fact, I realize I dropped out the Scrum metaphor, so I'll have to fix that. But it's kind of easy to do while I'm presenting because this is just the board. So I'll just take that right there. I'll get back into presentation mode. I'm going to talk about a few first principles, factors for effective value streams, and why Scrum works. It's important to know why it works when it does, because Scrum was designed for something in particular, and it's being used most of the time elsewhere. I'm going to introduce a concept that I have found absolutely essential for virtually every Agile project I've been on or engagement, and this goes back more than 15 years. It's called the minimum business increment. Uh, I'll tend to some other lean concepts that are quite useful that you can easily implement. The idea of what I'm doing here is I want to change your mindset a little bit. And then you could, with some minor changes in terms of activities, you can do Scrum a lot better. That's really the intention. This is not about abandoning Scrum per se. Although I will say, if you go through all these things, you'll probably find you're not doing Scrum anymore, at least by the Scrum guidebook, but it'll look kind of like Scrum. Okay. Uh, there's how to attend to value streams and some learning models. And then I have a little information about me if you want to participate. But this is not a sales pitch as much as an education. And if you're interested, of course, I do business by doing training, so I'd be happy, and I'll show you some opportunities. So in a nutshell, and you can also raise hands. I've got on I have a second monitor here where I can see everybody. So if you've got a question, raise your hand. Another thing you could do, this is a new trick I've been starting to do, and I think I've got everybody up here. When I used to do design pattern training at Net Objectives, actually we expanded this to any kind of training. We used to put out 3 pipe cleaners on people's desks or seats when they came in. One was green, one was red, one was yellow. And it was kind of a joke because we always had the red bar, green bar for TDD. And that's kind of where we got the idea, though yellow doesn't mean anything in TDD. But what we said was that if the instructor would say, if I say something and it resonates with you, just hold up the green sticky. You just put it up and then put it down. If I said something you disagreed with, put up the red, because sometimes people don't really want to ask the question, but they want to say, I don't really believe that. That way they could kind of anonymously say, more, please, because I don't agree. And if they didn't quite understand it, they'd use yellow. So what we're going to do instead, I invite you to, you don't have to. If your video's on, just, hey, that was good. Hey, I need more. I disagree. You can do that. I'll see it if you've got your video on. And if you don't, just go to the reactions and use the thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs up, thumbs sideways. I need more thumbs down for like green, yellow, red. I appreciate not using another finger for red, but but you can. It's not recorded. You're off screen. But anyway, in a nutshell, Scrum talks about we're going to do inspect and adapt, and part of that is we look to see what happens and we then adjust to it, okay? But it doesn't have first principles, and I'm going to talk about first principles a lot. A lot of these are known. Now, back in 1995, they weren't well known. In fact, I don't think they started to become really well known, at least in the software area and the product development area, until around 2005, 2006, when even though they were pretty well known before then, it wasn't until the Poppendix book on lean software development, which didn't talk about them either, really. They kind of took things from manufacturing and applied them into software. But the idea that there was an environment and you had to pay attention to it and it had consequences and you had to look at the system and the value stream started becoming more popular. At least the shell was cracked. I would say it didn't become really known until Don Reinertson's book, Principles of Product Development Flow, second generation lean product development. And there's a clue in the title. The main title has flow and the subtitle has lean, which may make you think that lean is not as important as flow. And actually I use flow and lean in theory constraints. I'll talk about them a little bit. But the idea is they are coherent with each other. But as we learn flow, and theory constraints been around forever, but I admit guilty that I kept thinking it was about manufacturing and I didn't really get into it. I don't know, some years ago, but well after reading The Goal. I mean, it was like, I was very slow on this update. So there's more than just inspect and adapt. A lot of people kind of don't know, or they don't want to admit now, Scrum was evolved out of empirical process control. Now they say empiricism, but it was empirical process control. Read Ken's first book, Agile Software Development, with Scrum and also just personal conversations. I was a big Scrum groupie in the first few years. I was a big XP groupie, actually, also in the first few years. And one of the stories he talked about is how he was at a major chemical company where he was project management type, and he went there to talk to them, and they were kind of laughing at him. You can't predict this stuff. It's all just not deterministic at all. And what you do is you get all these chemicals coming together, and then you see what happens, and then you respond to it. That's where the inspect and adapt. But what's ignored is even that was not truly the whole case, because they didn't just randomly put the chemicals together. They'd figured out what chemicals they needed to put together in order to get what you wanted. So there was a theory behind all this, and somehow Ken kind of missed that. And it was just, okay, let's get started. Let's find a framework that works, and then we'll inspect and adapt. But the theory is really critical. And how do you start needs theory to understand what's going to happen. I'm going to talk about that to some level. I really think there's kind of an insanity present in the industry where Scrum, which is the basis for a lot of work, talks about we're in a complex adaptive system and we can't look at things and get any kind of deterministic view. I disagree with that. And it kind of keeps us in this negative cycle. Instead of synergistic, where the cycle leads us up, it's what's called antergistic, which is the cycle gets us to go down. And we've been stuck in this for a long time. And I want to recognize that in 1995, when Scrum came out, we didn't know how flow theory constraints and lean worked well together in product development and in software in particular, but in product development in general. And there is complexity out there. I'm not saying there isn't. Of course, there's complexity out there. The question is how you deal with it. And I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to say right now, though, as a little bit of a background, that there are 3 areas you need to deal with complexity. One is our workflows. One is how we get our job done. One is how we communicate. And you know what? I don't think looking at it as complex is the right way there. We want to look at the relationships, and some are simple, some are complicated, some are complex. Some are potentially nonlinear events. A little thing happens, a big shift happens. And some are coupled with each other. That's a better way to look at it. And I'm going to suggest that knowledge work is complex by nature, okay? And that we need to look at that. We need to look at it that way. And then product development, though, that is complex. We don't really know our customers that well. We're all sorts of unknown stuff. And then the world, COVID, Ukraine war, inflation, new elections. We can't predict that stuff. However, notice what you need in all 3 of these is you need to be able to respond quickly. You need to get feedback quickly. So the question isn't just how do you inspect and adapt? The question is how do you work? How do you focus on your work, which you have some control over, so you can get quick feedback and respond to the stuff you can't control, that you can't understand? And that's basically what this talk is about. Now I'm going to use Scrum as an example because it's well known, but the ideas work everywhere. And that's kind of the point. Okay. So first, I like contrast. I don't know why people don't like contrast. All sorts of neuroscience and education for decades tells us when you talk to people about what they know and you contrast it with something new and you move them from one to the other, people learn better. Differences are what actually helps understanding. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Scrum. I'm going to talk a little bit about Amplio. And Scrum is a framework basically within which people are supposed to figure out how to work. It doesn't tell you how to work. It exposes impediments for you, and then you figure it out. It's rooted in an 86 article by Nonaka and Takeuchi, 2 Japanese professors. I met Nonaka once. He's probably passed now. This was a long time ago. I was at an Agile. He and I were keynotes at a Agile Japan in Tokyo. Very sweet man, very smart. And the 2 of them in 86 wrote a book, not a book, an article called The New Product Development Game. And in there, he talks about when you're building new products, this is a new way to build new products, about how you need to respond, how you can have a plan. Like in rugby, you have a plan going downfield, but you don't stick with it because you got to adjust. And in rugby, when the ball goes out of play or something needs to reset, they do what's called a scrum. It looks like a huddle, but people are trying to kill themselves not themselves, the opponent team in the huddle. I've never played rugby, but I've heard bad stories. And that's where Scrum gets its name, is the approach is you do something, you reset, you do something, you reset. And originally the idea was on a regular basis, and Scrum, when it first was done at people.
Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Somebody is some background. Could people mute themselves just in general? It'd be a good idea. Thank you. So the idea is you're getting interactions all the time. Now, what was left out of this is 2 years later, the same two people wrote another book called Toward Middle Up-Down Management, where he talks about the importance of ecosystems and managers creating great environments. And Scrum never embraced that, never embraced this notion of systems thinking, and that most of our problems actually are what Deming, the guy who basically taught the Japanese how to have high quality and in some senses a foundation for lean. Deming taught that you have to look for common cause errors, which are due to the system versus system cause. So that's one of the big things there. So it comes from its own theory. There is theory in Scrum, but it's basically what Ken and Jeff says will work. It's not what I call first principles, which is something that stands on its own and is observable. I can observe what I think are first principles, but I'm not making them up. I'm just going to say some things. I think, hey, I think this is like a natural law, like gravity. So Scrum is a framework. It's based on empiricism, like what happens. And I like to say what doesn't have empiricism in it. That's great, but I use empiricism too. I just add rationalism and theory to it. Requires people to decide on their own practices. This is good. It's an acknowledgement there's no one set way. So let's have a framework that people can figure out what they do. But guess what? The things it does tell us to do in the framework may not be universal either. Iterations, which are called sprints, cross-functional teams, which is a particular kind of value creation structure. Back in 95, that's what we knew. In fact, that didn't change a lot until around 2009, 2008, maybe 2007 when Kanban came out. And there's no overreaching theory because people don't believe there is one. In a complex adaptive system, you can't predict. So the idea is you expose impediments, people figure it out. Now, that may have been true back in 2001, 2002, when I was doing Scrum, fair amount, but to be candid, I did Scrum because I couldn't get people to do XP. I was trying to do that, but pairing and test-driven, test first wasn't very popular. So I would always try to get XP done, then I'd do Scrum if I needed to. So it worked. There was another thing that was implied in Scrum, which is that people were early adopters. They were going to go and figure out what they missed. So Scrum worked well in that situation. But let me ask you this. I'm not looking for an answer. I want you to answer it yourself. Back then, the people who are trying to do Scrum kind of fit the mold. But now, how many teams are truly autonomous, are truly cross-functional, are boarded with people, are made up of people who are truly trying to figure things out and have complete autonomy in the whole thing? And there's almost maybe 5 or 10%. Most of the people doing Scrum don't fit the bill for what it was designed for. And nobody wants to acknowledge this. They'll just say, oh, it's good where any complex is. No. First of all, if you're doing product development, you're in a complex environment. End of story. Different aspects are more or less complex. So Amplio says, first of all, we're going to base it on theories and practices of flow, lean, and theory constraints. So it's also got empiricism in it, but it's got theory besides. I'm going to give you a set of insights that can guide you. Now, I'm covering the tip of the iceberg. I have a workshop that takes like 4 months, not every day, a couple hours a week, 3 weeks on, 1 week off, 3 weeks on, where I go into this in very deep level called the Amplio Development the Amplio Development Masterclass. But you can get a lot from this and then further study and go forward. Okay, it's also a pattern language. Patterns are solutions to recurring problems in a context. And what I've identified is about 30, 35 things you have to do at the team level. There's another 20 or 30 you have to do at the whole organization level. And I have them organized as solutions. Oh, here's the way to do this. And then you have multiple ways. So a pattern is a statement, I have this problem, I got to solve it, but there are multiple ways to implement it. The pattern language gives it structure because people like structure. I mean, some don't, maybe I don't, but most do, and I know that. And the pattern then, so you have this language that gives you structure, but you have the individual ways of solving because they like certainty. But the other thing is nobody's the same. Even the structure isn't the same. Although most companies that don't have regulation or don't have hardware involved, more or less have to do the same thing. Companies that have regulation and hardware involved have those additional constraints, but then you could add patterns or take them away. I'm going to talk about how we use empiricism and theory. Deals with complexity by a focus on eliminating delays, by eliminating unplanned work. See, most people do a lot more unplanned work than planned work. And I don't mean because somebody interrupted them. Nobody planned to write a bug and then spend hours fixing the bug. Nobody planned on having a misunderstanding of a requirement and then had to rewrite the thing. I'm not going to take a pro or a con with a no estimation crowd. I actually believe estimation of some things in some ways is good, and I believe in some ways it isn't good. But let me tell you why no estimates are so bad. It's not because people can't estimate. There are ways to estimate. That's outside of the scope of this talk. But nobody estimates the unplanned work, which is more than what they're estimating. You think about that. If what you're not looking at is where most of the work is, and it is, just look in your past. Don't believe anything I say today, by the way. I actually say never trust a consultant, what a consultant says. I always start my workshops off. Now, I don't mean don't trust them for their motivation. I know a lot of really high integrity consultants. They're doing the best. There are some bad ones, but most of them are really doing the best. Don't trust what they say, though, because if I tell you something like delays are causing waste, why should you believe me? You've been doing this. Unless we got somebody just walked in off the streets, never done development before, the rest of you have experience. And you should use your experience to validate. And if you don't agree, you put the thumb down. Okay. Okay, so let's go to the next one. So we're going to head through this. This is more for reference, but I'm going to talk a little bit about this slide. This is the main thing. Delays in workflow and feedback create unplanned work to be done. And if you're working on 3 things, then that means 2/3 of the time, one of those things is being delayed. All of them are being delayed by about 2/3. Task switching is not the enemy. That's what everybody thinks. Oh, task switching, I'll lose 20%. True, you do lose 20%, but you will create just as much unplanned work as planned work. I'll call that waste as well. From going to one thing. If you're a developer, remember a time you wrote a bug, and you did write it, by the way. Testers didn't break your code and put it in. Yeah, it took me a long time to remember that that's what happens. But we complain about them finding it and then pretend they did it, but no, it's us. And if we detect it instantly, we can say, oh yeah, I remember doing that, was stupid. But a week later, what was I doing? I can't remember oh man. And it takes us hours to find the simple fix, same fix, but hours later. That's what I mean by created work. And I'm just going to have this for reference. Okay, I'm not going to go through this, don't have time. But if you just get what I just said, delays in workflow cause waste. Here's the other big one. Delays in feedback cause waste. I ask the PO, hey, what do I do? And she tells me, and I get it wrong, a little error. I go build the whole system. Then I can't get her because she's traveling, doing something. A month later, I find out I did it wrong. But other people have been using what I wrote. The waste expands. If it ever goes out the field, it's really bad. But I'm talking about never escape stuff, causes huge waste. We have to look at delays. Now we're going to see actually why Scrum works, because it attends to it to some level when it does. So this is really critical. Ample is based on first principle. Now, a first principle is something that's just there. Like I'm saying, delays cause waste. I didn't invent that. I didn't create it. I'm not making that up. If you can disprove it, then disprove it. That's fine. I mean, it's like Newton's laws of momentum and stuff. It's thermodynamics. Except in our world, it's not quite as mechanistic as that. So I don't want to call it a natural law, but you get the idea of what I'm talking about. So first principles are used to provide a basic understanding of what's happening. I've already mentioned a few. And the idea is you see what happens and you test your understanding of the first law, knowing you're wrong. As George Bach says, all models are wrong, some are useful. So what you're trying to do is be less wrong as we go forward. But you always know you're not quite right, okay? So that's an important thing. In fact, there's George right here. So I'm going to talk about these quickly. This is a quick cut. It's not a whole thing. The mindset, as I've been mentioned, is great value for customers, stakeholders. That's where you got to be coming from. By the way, lean does not work for companies that are trying to do cost plus. In fact, I had this happen to me about 15 years ago. I was talking to them about lean and they said, well, why would we do that? And I said, well, what do you mean? Well, we make our money on how much cost we have. And you're telling us how to drop our costs by half. We'll make half the money we're making now. We don't want to do that. That was in the defense industry. I'm not kidding. It was a real conversation. Now, eventually, there was some change about that with the government about why you have to use Agile and drop costs. But at the time, if you're not looking at saving costs, Agile ain't for you. So we can understand what's going on in the complex systems. Maybe not fully, but reasonably close, at least in the development part. You have to attend to value streams. I'll talk about that a little bit. Systems thinking, everything relates to is essential. We must continuously question our methods. Again, Amplio is not about improving you. It's about actually improving itself as much. Here are some first principles. I've got 8 here. There are others. People say, well, that's just a few of them. And the answer is right. I give you 100. But that'll actually impede you because you can't think of 100 things. So I always try to keep 7 plus or minus 2 when I come up with something, and the fewer the better. So we can complete smaller items faster than larger ones. So I think you've seen that. Local improvements don't necessarily result in global improvements. There's a corollary to that, by the way. Sometimes to improve the global result, you have to slow down and do worse yourself. That's sometimes why HR gets in the way, because they say, no, you're doing worse, you're not getting your money. But in fact, that's needed sometimes. We can't manage what we don't see. I'll get out of the argument, we got to measure it and all that. I like measurement when you can, but if you can't see it, you definitely ain't managing it. Delays in workflow and getting feedback and taking advantage of lessons learned. Any kind of delay in that is going to cause waste, extra work, unplanned work. We only see what we think and talk about. People working beyond capacity, overworked, cause delays, waste. Handoffs cause loss of knowledge and information. People doing the work have more insights into how it should be done. This is the self-organization. But we do want to acknowledge self-organization could also be wrong organization. I see a lot of teams doing the wrong stuff. Just because they're self-organizing doesn't mean they're right organizing. So again, you go back to first principles. That can be yeah, I see, Nancy, you're right. It's a tough issue because how do you determine who's right or who's not right? Well, talk about proven things and have a conversation, have a Socratic discussion about it. Okay. Quick feedback can mitigate the fog of complexity. As my wife says, though, there's only one thing that mitigates the fog of no coffee, and that's more coffee. Anyway, innovate by attending to the customer journey and attend to the quality of the product. Okay. So having studied this, starting to get this in like 2006, 2007, starting to see this, I started noticing there were patterns to what I called, I call them factors for effective value streams. Now you notice this at an intuitive level. And let me tell you that while you can be reviewing this too, but you ever walk into a place and you say, wow, they get a lot of work done here. This is cool. Or you walk into a place and say, man, how do they get anything done here? See, intuitively, you know this stuff. Intuitively, you know if you're working on huge things, it ain't going to work. If it's not visible, nobody can manage it. Okay, that actually is that shouldn't say our people attending to the value stream. That's an extra one. Are people's workloads within capacity? Are we getting feedback quickly? These are things that when you do them, things go better. And what's interesting is they all work with each other. That's what's really cool. In other words, if you work on smaller things, you can avoid overloading better. You can get feedback quicker. This was Goldrat's real insight when he talks about inherent simplicity, that not only is it a few things, but they're in harmony with each other. Nature's in harmony. Actually, he quotes Isaac Newton as saying this. I think that's kind of cool. I'd seen this in the design pattern work I did about how you design, that the patterns were in harmony with each other. So these 9 things are things to attend to. Now, I'm going to give a little Scrum summary here. And again, as I mentioned, those of you might have come in late, you can actually get on this board and see it. I just put in the chat. Again, if you want to kind of zoom in and look around, that's fine. No problem with that. This is like just the outline of Scrum summary. To me, the most important things and the reason Scrum works is because they have short cycles, relative speaking anyway, 2 weeks isn't bad. And they have quick reviews like the daily Scrum. And actually, I should have added the daily Scrum into this. But the big ones for me are sprint planning and the cross-functional team. Okay. So let's look at, with this in mind, let's look at this. And in fact, let me show you how I change things. I'm not supposed to do this probably, but I'm gonna put this right here and I'm gonna say, wait a moment, what about daily scrums? Daily scrums. Well, that gives me feedback. Oh, cool. There, why does Scrum work? Well, this is a little bit of why it works. It works because cross-functional team makes all work visible to the team. It's organized in a way that reduces waiting for others. It a little bit, that's why it's dashed, a little bit attends to value streams because it's only one part of it, but it does it well there. Sprints, time boxing helps us work on high value items. It makes them also smaller because it's got to fit in what you're working on. Workflow are within the capacity because you're pulling it. You can focus on the quality of the product because of the feedback. And Daily Scrum gives us feedback on that. See, this is why Scrum works, really. I guess there's a focus on continuous improvement, but I'm not going to give inspect and adapt credence here because they don't improve Scrum. They improve people working in Scrum, and you really need to improve Scrum. That's what I'm talking about. Okay. By the way, I've got the chat up. I'm not going to stop and ask for questions, but if you've got something where you misunderstood or disagreed, and oh, thanks about where Ken's story is. I'll take a look. Yeah, the black cover with the different colors on the front too. Anyway, okay, so let's just keep going with this. Okay, so I'm going to introduce something that Scrum doesn't talk about. Actually, SAFe doesn't talk about. I don't know anybody who talks about it except Steve Tendon's TameFlow. He calls it a move, and I forget what move stands for. But it's minimum business increment. I'll talk about that in a minute. But MVP has been defined at least 3 ways. It started with Frank Robinson in 2001. And Frank Robinson's MVP is similar to Denny and Cleveland Wing's MMF and our MBI. So I'm not going to use this. I'm going to use Eric Ries. I highly, 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 highly recommend reading Eric Ries's The Startup Way. It's just brilliant. And what I also like about it, he's got a lot of anecdotes where you can relate to the problem of being a consultant. I mean, I like his lean. I like his lean. What is it? Lean Startup. His first book. That's brilliant too. But I really like the second one better. Not a surprise. Very often that's the case. So an MVP is you're trying to discover if you have a product, not how to build it, but if you've got one. It's basically intended for startups, but it can be used in big companies now with a startup way. They're just building a new product. So it's a startup mentality. It's usually done by a small team that's somewhat isolated from the rest of the organization, but not totally. You still have to follow legal and HR and stuff like that. But my question is, what happens if you use if you're in an established company, you have an enhancement. You know this is going to be good. You don't know all the details, but it's not a startup product. It's an existing product you're enhancing. What do you do there? MVPs aren't designed for that. An MVP, as it's stated in SAFe, is just wrong. I mean, they've gutted it. It's useless. It's not about thin slices. Of course, everything you build should be in thin slices. MVPs, according to Eric Ries, which is what he claims is coming from, is about discovery of a new product. Now, we changed minimum marketable feature. This was inspired from the software by numbers, and we changed the name for 2 reasons. Well, we changed the name for 1 reason, and then I got a better one later, to be truthful. The reason we changed it is we would go into clients. I can remember one, I lost the account because of this. Not just because of the name, but actually the way I talked to them. I didn't appreciate that they didn't build products. They were an IT organization. They just built support stuff. And I was talking to them like products because that's kind of how I think. And to me, their support was a product, but an internal product. But they didn't make that leap, and I wasn't talking to them properly. But I remember when I mentioned minimum marketable feature, they said, well, we don't market things. We just build stuff for our people who use it and they market stuff. So we're not writing marketable features. Oh, yeah, I guess not. So I couldn't talk to them in their language. We tried something else, minimum viable release, minimum viable feature. We tried about 5 or 6 things. About every month we would change the name and then come across somebody who didn't like it. And then I remember talking to Alan Shuttlewater, our president, who had a lot of work to do in the MBI part. He said, well, look, what do we really have here? And he said, well, we got business increment. We're delivering the quickest thing we can of a business increment. So it's the minimum business increment. Well, why don't we call it that? And he said, yeah, okay, MBI. And that was like, I don't know, 15 years ago. It matches. Again, MMF and SAFe has nothing to do with Denny and Cleveland Wang's MMF. For whatever reason, Dean decided to throw that in to the Lean UX, which does not mention MMFs. And the way MMFs use, they're just thin slices. MMFs are not just thin slices. They are functionality that can be marketed and released. Now, I said there were 2 reasons. So the first one was what I just said. We wanted a better name. but it has since morphed. Our MBI is not the same as dynamically one's MMF, although it's implied. We add to the MBI who needs to do it, what capabilities are there, the whole thing, marketing, documentation, operations, and it gives us a way to manage CapEx and OpEx in allocation. That's beyond the scope of this. Remember, we're at the team level with Scrum. But the purpose of an MBI is not to do less. It's about delivering value sooner. And on a Scrum team, the idea is instead of being forced to look at the sprint goal, you want to look at what can I release next? And that might be over several goals because sometimes things take more than 2 weeks to do. You write a flight control system of a aircraft, you know, that takes more than a day, it takes more than a week, it takes more than a month or two. It takes a while. So the sprint goal is not always longer than the value goal, and the value goal is not always as long as the sprint goal. So we want to decouple those things. That's a flow model. And the interesting observation, again, by Ellie Goldratt, this is an old one, often reducing batch size is all it takes to bring a system back into control. So that's useful. Okay, this is for reference, but you get the idea. MVPs are about discovering if a new product is viable, and MBIs are about enhancing an existing product. There are quite a few differences. I don't have time to go through, but I thought it would be useful. You will have, I gave you the access to the board. I'm not taking that away, by the way. So after this presentation, or if you're listening to this and you have a question, just add a comment to it. You can't edit it, but you can add a comment and I'll respond to those. Okay, so I've given you one thing already. Try to look at MBIs. And there are a lot of articles on MBIs. I'll have to add that too. I'll make a note. I don't have references. I'll add some reference. Like there's stuff on MBIs you can read. Okay, here's a simple idea. Well, wait a moment. If we're trying to eliminate delay, let's just zoom in on this. Let's say I'm in this situation. Let's say I have an MBI and it's got a couple of features. And I've built 2 stories of this feature. And I haven't started this feature yet. And I've got some time. Should I build this story or this story? I could do either one of them. Which one should I pick? Well, if I pick this one, I finish the feature. If I pick this one, I open up a new feature. It's going to take longer from the start of the feature until it's done. First principles tell me to finish this one. See, if I do this one, I complete the feature. I've actually completed my stories. I've gotten feedback on the feature. I'm still not done with the MBI. But if in fact I do this one, then I don't have feedback on the features yet. This is a risk. Maybe I'm doing it wrong. So this is one thing to do right here, is attend to what you finish. Let me come back here. Don't open stories, features, and MBIs. Opening them is all risk. Don't open up a story if you can finish one. If you're going to open up a story, do it in a feature that's already open. If you're going to open up a new feature, do it in an MBI that's been open. That's the idea. Okay. This is another one. I want to see what I'm talking about is how you can improve delays, shortening delays. Smaller things cuts delays. What you close shortens delays. And here's another one. So I like to prevent errors if you can. And there's a lot of stuff I do in design. But quick detection, what's not appreciated is error detection quickly can turn into prevention. In other words, let's just say I've got this is like a timeline, a week, and let's say I'm doing a flow and I make an error and I detect it right away. Well, I can stop that right then and there. Maybe it's how I'm working, maybe it's I made an error, it doesn't replicate. But if I've got a 2-week sprint, I might detect that, but I don't fix it. Okay, now Scrum purists say, well, you don't have to do this. Yeah, well, I don't really care what I have to do. I care what happens. There's this thing called, in theory and practice are the same, but in practice, they're different. And this is what I see. If you do retros, if you wait till the end, what could have stopped here typically happens there. And if you do a retro in the middle of the sprint, you at least get better. So this is another thing you can do. How do you focus on that? Okay. Okay. This is the picture. This is a great story. The way I tell it is you got a policeman here and he sees somebody crawling around on his hands and knees looking for something. He asks him, "What are you doing?" He says, "Hey, officer, I'm looking for my keys," except he says it in a slurry junk way. "I'm looking for my keys, officer." And now he figures, well, he better find the keys so he doesn't drive home. They look for about 5 or 10 minutes. He's helping him. He can't find them. And he says, "Are you sure you dropped them here?" I said, "No, officer. I dropped them down in the alley." "Then why are we looking here?" "Light's better." This is like frameworks. This is where we look. But we leave out things like the impedance scorecard or the factors for effective value stream. We leave out MBIs. We leave out first principles. And as Edgar Schein says, we do not think and talk about what we see, what we're able to think and talk about. This is what drives me nuts when I hear purposely incomplete. You know what? The gasoline tank liner of a Pinto that used to blow up on collisions was left out intentionally. Just because you leave it out doesn't mean it was a good idea to leave it out. And if what happens, if you say, by the way, if you do outside of the lamp, you're not doing Scrum anymore, you've now created momentum to not go out because you were likely hired, if you're a Scrum Master, you're hired as a Scrum Master to do what's within. You can't say, well, we should be doing something out. Say, well, how do you know? Well, it just feels right. Well, you're a Scrum Master, right? Do you have a Kanban certification? I hired you as a Scrum Master. Whether that is actually ever said, it's implied. This is why I hate the mutability of things. We've got to be careful about this. Notice first principles don't have a lamp. One lamp, it may be one first principles, one lamp, and another is another lamp, but there's no boundary to it. Delays always cause, delays in workflow, delays in feedback, delays in using knowledge is always a bad thing. Now, that doesn't tell you what to do because there aren't many practices that are universal. There are a couple, but they're not that many. Here's one, since I said there are some, somebody will say, no, there aren't. Well, here's one. When you're a developer and somebody asks you to do something, always ask them, and how will I know I've done that? Always. May not do you any good, but it costs almost nothing. And guess what? They're going to figure it out eventually. Make them figure it out before you do the work, then instead of when they see what you did. Doesn't cost a thing. May not do you any good, but it doesn't cost anything. Anyway. So, oops, I just realized. Oh, no, I need kind of, so here's what's cool about Miro's. You can, just to show you, this was in the starting point. You could, if you come in like this, you can always click this and this comes out. I want to remind ourselves about the factors for effective value streams. See, we already talked about this quickly, and you might want to pull this up on your screen. Number 8, factors for effective value streams. Wall, I talk about this. So I'm going to suggest that if you've got something that's not working, you don't have to follow what the framework says. You need to go back to the first principles. So if you're having challenges with the practice, ask, well, am I doing it poorly? They say to do this sprint plan. Well, we're not really doing sprint planning very well. We're throwing stuff together. Maybe we ought to just learn how to do this better. Okay. Is there something else in the organization causing the problem? Well, yeah, the product owners aren't coming and talking to us. So we're not doing it well because something else is causing a problem. Is the ecosystem. So I'm going through, I'm saying, are there things we could do? So first look to see if you can fix it. Do it better. Go outside your team. See if somebody's impacting you. Yeah, these guys are always interrupting us so we can't get our job done. But maybe it's the wrong practice. If there aren't universal practices, maybe planning of that type or iterations aren't the right thing to do. Then you ask, what else can we do? This is where the discipline agile browser is good. It's got a whole bunch of them. This is where you can look at the Scrum plot, where they have all the patterns there that you can do. But then you decide if you want to do it or not by looking at the factors for effective value streams. Okay. Is it going to be better? Does it shorten delay? Does it create visibility? Am I working on higher value? See, we can navigate this. Now, that's not a supposition, by the way. A lot of people have gotten irritated that I've said this. I'm not the only one in the world who does this. I know dozens of people who've done this. I mean, where I can remember their names. But I know I've talked to hundreds of people who've done this. So I ain't lying like I've been accused of when I say this. There are lots of people who do this. It's not, I don't know what to do. You got to know what to look at first. Remember, Edgar Schein, we don't talk and think about what we see. We see what we're able to think and talk about. So if you don't attend to this stuff, you won't do it, but you can. This is a similar way. Should you use time boxing like sprints, or should you use a flow model? Again, this is more for reference. But I suggest you can ask yourself, well, are people familiar with Scrum? Then Kanban? If so, maybe time box. Actually do these little checklists. Oh, if they already know how to time box, maybe I'll use that as a start. Would it be easier for a transition to the team? Sometimes it is. Sometimes it isn't. The culture of a team and their background has a big play on how you should do things. Can the team look ahead a week or so? You know, sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. If you're in a maintenance organization where you're responding to things, it's absurd to plan. Imagine you're a firefighting company and say, well, we're going to have a fire downtown on Tuesday, and we're going to actually accidentally set our own kitchen on fire on Wednesday. And my wife, I know she's cooking something where she set the oven on fire 3 times. That's going to happen. I mean, it's ridiculous. If you're responding to things, remember, Scrum is about building new products where you don't have that outside influence. I remember for years, there was this question, how do you deal with maintenance in Scrum? Instead of asking the question, admittedly, I was as guilty of this as anybody, maybe you shouldn't be doing Scrum when this is going on. Of course, I didn't know flow at the time, so I didn't know how to handle it, okay? Yeah, symptoms and causes, absolutely. There's one thing to keep in mind that I may have mentioned, but I'll mention it again. See, there's this thing called common cause. The system is causing the problem as opposed to special cause. Somebody just had a bad night the night before, came in and started making some mistakes. That's at least the first level of cause and effect. Do releases typically take more than one iteration? If they do, then time boxing is fine because we're going to build part of it. But if you have several releases in a 2-week period, it's not usually a good way to go. Here's how you would choose flow: building a new product, doing more than 20% maintenance work. I just threw that out as a number, but any significant amount of maintenance work. Planning new work's difficult. You know, continuously being interrupted by other teams that you can't stop the interruptions. Of course, you want to stop them, but maybe there's a better way. Are you willing to get more disciplined? Because flow is more efficient. Remember, if we go back to this, we discover things faster. Okay, so I'm going to talk about value streams a little bit. Just a second, I want to see where I am. Okay, I'm 20, and I got, oh, good, I'm in good shape. I'm not, this is a problem. I should put page numbers on these, but I didn't. Anyway, what are value streams? So value streams are end-to-end. They're more like networks. They're not linear in development, but they still hold the name. Value networks, that's fine. Value chains, that's fine. They tend to overlap different. It's an end-to-end for a particular product or value. And there are different kinds of value stream. I'm going to go through this. You can look at it all, but it's better if you come with me on this. There are 4 kinds of value streams, as I describe them. Some people talk about 14 different kinds of value streams. Some people talk only about 2. Development value streams are the value streams that build the other ones. Like, what's the customer value stream? How do they get their work done? It's often called the customer journey, is the interaction between them and us. Okay. They're operations, not operational, operations value streams. These are how operations sets up to support the product, and business enabling value streams. All 3 of these are jointly called operational value streams. So development value streams build these 3. This comes from Alan Ward, and I forget the other guy's name. Alan, unfortunately, passed away in a car crash, not a car crash, an auto crash airplane crash years ago. Lean product development was a book that he wrote with somebody else. Can't remember. That guy's now big at LEI, Lean Enterprise Institute. And he talked about, you have to pay attention. Development value streams build these other value streams. Now, the business stakeholders is often not part of any of these value streams. They do their own work with strategies, initiatives that create the context for what we're doing. Again, beyond the scope, but just trying to point out some things. We talk about this in the Discipline Agile Value Stream Consultant Workshop if you're interested. Now, here's what's interesting. I suggest when you think about value streams, you notice there are 5 things in the value streams that are of interest. What goes into them, the workload of the people in the value stream, the workflow of the value stream. In other words, what's your process? Are there feedback loops? Are there gaps and workflow problems? How are they organized? And what's the mindset? And these numbers here relate to the 9 factors for effective value streams. In other words, what goes in, you want small, high visible value. You want to manage your workflow, probably with pull. It doesn't actually have to be pull, but that's typically the way to do it. Minimize delays while quickening feedback, have high product quality. Organize people. This is called value creation structure. There are a lot of good books, dynamic reteaming, team topologies, organize for complexity. There are a couple others. It's gotten to be a bit nice now that there are books about this. And the mindset, business agility via value stream management. That's why most of my work's around the value stream. That's a good way to do it. You manage your ecosystem and you do continuous improvement. A lot of this mindset needs to be reflected by management. So this is how you change and improve these things. Okay. Learning models. This is a big difference. I've been harping on this for years. I still can't seem to get it across. I love this quote from Deming. Experience teaches nothing. In fact, there's no experience to record without theory. Theory is this model we create based on our experience. This is empiricism and rationalism. Nobody's seen a black hole, but there's stuff because we've got theories about it that helps us. What was that? There was a particle that they theorized for years and years, and they just found one. Subatomic particle thing. Sorry, I can't remember the name. Theory is useful. We can make predictions with theory. In fact, this is what I like, that it was a scientist who's respected said this. Scientists investigate that which already is. Engineers create what has never been. We use the theory and we go beyond. Our practice is making up something new. I've had very good success doing this. Anyway, experience teaches nothing. There's nothing to record. Without theory, there's no real learning. This is their downfall. People copy examples and then wonder, what happened? It's not working. What's interesting, now we actually talk in Amplio, I talk about plan, do, study, adjust, but it's also known as plan, do, study, act. And this is one of the key things about lean learning. We have a plan, we do it, we get results, and then we act on the basis of the results. That's single loop learning. Double loop learning is we say, maybe we ought to change our assumptions. Maybe time boxing ain't the right thing. Maybe cross-functional teams we can't achieve or it's too expensive. This is double loop learning. There's even this thing called triple loop learning where we learn how to do this questioning better. Okay, and I've got some articles on that. Okay, so getting close to the end. So complexity, this comes from the choice. First and most profound obstacle is that people believe reality is complex, and therefore they're looking for sophisticated explanations for complicated solutions. And this is devastating. He's not saying the world isn't complex. Actually, that's the weird thing. But if you take the attitude it's complex and you look for all this, it's a disaster. And a comfort zone has less to do with control and more to do with knowledge. This is why management executives often seem to be resisting things. It's not that we're asking them to give up command and control. We're asking them to go into an area where they don't know there's a solution. And it makes them nervous. Now, some want command and control, but most of them want to understand what's going on. So this idea of follow until you understand is absurd. They're smart people who have experience. Talk to their experience. So again, something Scrum consultants often don't do. They say, well, just trust me for all. It's like playing chess. No, it's not like playing chess. I lose a game, I lose a game. And chess is very well defined. It's like my company's game. What's that supposed to be? So instead of, and this is the key thing, instead of thinking we're in simple, complicated, complex, or chaotic domains, that's not exactly how people think about it. They have different ways, but this is one way. It's better to realize in knowledge work, you have relationships. Remember, systems are about relationships. Complex systems have complex relationships. So you have relationships that are clear or obvious. You have complicated, complex, potentially nonlinear events. A little thing like that straw I added to the camel's back that broke it, or that slight misunderstanding where a comma was that led to $1 million lawsuit. Those things kill us, and they're coupled. So one little thing ripples out into another. Now, the Titanic was an example of this. It didn't hit the iceberg that hard, and it sank, and thousands of people died. You know what? If you're on the Titanic, you're on a physical thing like 3 Mile Island. Something goes wrong with a valve that fails all the time or regular fails. There's nothing you could do about it. But in knowledge work, you can. There's a big difference between knowledge work and the physical work. And the book that kind of created this whole idea of complexity, I'm not going to go into this, notice I say for reference, but I want to point this out. And I have all articles in my book on this. This is not the normal way people talk about complexity, but this is the guy who kind of started it. He said some things are complex and some things are straightforward. And some things are loosely coupled and some things are tightly coupled. And notice where nuclear weapons and accidents and nuclear planes, tightly coupled and complex. One little thing happened and it did a whole bunch of stuff. Notice this, where knowledge work is done. Oh, it's complex, but it's not tightly coupled. See, I'm interested down here. I'm not building a theory of complexity. I'm saying, how do you deal with complexity in knowledge work? It's a different problem. This is a much easier problem to solve than this. This might be more interesting. I'm not saying that, but that's not what I'm doing. And I'm suggesting the way you solve it is you get quick feedback by eliminating delays. And when something goes wrong, you correct. Do you see that common theme throughout this last hour? This is cool. I'll tell you why it's cool. Serendipitous. First of all, it helps me work better. But notice, if I can respond fast now and a competitor comes up with a competing product, I can pivot faster. Notice if COVID comes around or the Ukraine war comes around, I could pivot faster. So I'm not saying you could figure that stuff out. That happens. But I can respond faster and I could work better. And to me, that's the real power. Okay, great. How about that? This is a place to go for more. If you've got, there are resources here. This is actually, you can click. This is another Miro board, but it's got a bunch of stuff. So all this stuff is available to you right away. You could tell people too about it. I did record this. I am going to make it available immediately. That means a day or two for me on our Amplio Community of Practice series that this is part of, by the way. That's what we did this on. Every other Thursday I do something. Sometimes I do talks, sometimes I do other things. I will make the recording publicly available in about a month. I'm trying to get people to join the Amplio. There's no charge, by the way, to this. I do this as a, well, it's not so much altruistic. It is paying back to the universe, I guess, but mostly it's because I'm hoping it'll help with my frustration of people doing the wrong stuff so much. And it is a way to get business too, I will admit. Anyway, these are some different things. I'm going to say one more minute and then I'm going to just ask questions. So the Amplio Community Practice is free every other week, more or less. Do these talks, do some other things. The Teams Masterclass, if you're interested in how to do good stuff at the team level, this is a program that goes 4 months. There are 12 sessions, each session, 12 lessons. Each lesson has 2 parts to it. It's really about how to be a great coach at that level. The Amplio Consultant Educator Program is actually where I hope I'm teaching the super premier expert coaches. I'm just doing brain dump once a week about different topics. It's very advanced, very cutting edge. I teach a discipline agile value stream consultant workshop from the PMI, and I have a way of doing improving safe with lean agile. There are resources. Here's a case study. Blast is something I came up with back in 2006, I think 2007. And it actually is kind of like a predates Nexus, but it's kind of like a better Nexus. I didn't really think much of it at first. I just thought, well, okay, it's a one-off way I figured out how to do something. And then when I came across Nexus, I realized, wait a moment, this is something I did that they did, and this is better. So I wrote it up and defined it. And what was interesting about this case study is I took a company that actually Jeff Sutherland had trained. So they were well trained. They did Scrum really well, but they couldn't get the last inch, the last value out. They had some problems with it. And by using lean thinking and flow, ironically, they reorganized into cross-functional teams that they had just reorganized out of because they couldn't see how to do it with cross-functional teams. And after I showed them what I showed them, then they went back into doing Scrum well. So sometimes this is just about doing Scrum better. Okay. Questions? Either through the chat or just talk. Well, call it a day. I hope this was of use. Please do look out the resources. I'll let me know if you had found this valid. Just shoot me an email or something. And I guess thanks for being here.
This was really good. Thank you.
Oh, good, David.
And
yeah, I think
you were talking earlier about, I think, and I forget exactly what you were talking about, but you were talking about, just basically people copycatting something.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of, people used to ask Toyota why you let all these people come in and see what you do, you know? And it's like, well, you don't have our people. So,
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you say that because when I read, and I highly recommend reading Taichi Ohno's book, The Toyota Production System. When I
yes.
read that and I read what people were saying about it, I said, people are really misinterpreting this because he's not talking about systems thinking. He's not talking directly about what Deming was talking about. And I interpreted that the reason he wasn't talking about it was because to him it was just totally natural. I mean, everybody in Japan, not everybody, but in Japan, that was kind of the way you did things. And so I talk about it. I didn't ask you all to breathe. You're breathing this whole time. That's a useful thing. So that's why he wasn't talking about it. Let's just pull it back here. But later I found out there was another reason he wasn't talking about it. And he confessed to this later. He said he didn't talk about it because he didn't really want to give away the secrets that he had, that he intentionally left some things out because, well, they were a competing company and it sounded nice what he was saying, but they really weren't doing it. And then I realized, oh, that's why he didn't talk about it, not because it was natural. And that was a mindset issue. See, this is mindset is so critical. Scrum's mindset is you have a framework and you have people figure it out, and they don't, but nobody looks at that, which is ironic because they're the ones who say they're based on empiricism, and then they forget to analyze the data that's out there. The data that's out there is most people, by Ken Schwaber even says it, most people, 75% was the number he gave, will not get the value they hoped to get from it, they expected to get from it. But nobody talks about why. They just say, oh, that's because they're not doing Scrum. Which is like if you're a financial advisor, well, I told you to buy low and sell high. You didn't do that. So, of course, you lost money. If you can do what Scrum says, that's okay, but you often can't. That's often not the best for your situation. So, yeah, if I was to say what's lean about in one sentence, I'll do it in 4 words. Lean is about learning. It's not about all this other stuff. It's really about learning. I didn't know this for a long time, I admit. I learned it when I read this book by Michael Ballet called Lean Strategies. And he makes it very clear that it's all about learning. Now, we're going to learn how to do better, so I got to pay attention to delays. I got to do systems thinking. I got to get quick feedback. I've got to continuously improve. But the underlying one thing is about learning. And that was because his people needed to learn. He had a lot of equipment. Oddly enough, after World War II, apparently Toyota had equipment. It wasn't bombed out and all that like you'd expect. He had people, though, who weren't educated, didn't know how to do their job. So he set up a learning organization using lean thinking and systems thinking. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The true destination is not to be an agile organization, but a learning organization.
That's correct. And then you'll become an agile organization out of that. Business agility through learning, and I said value stream management. That's what you have to learn.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other comments? Okay.
I would just like to say one of the things I like about
Nancy,
your approach to things in general, Al,
yeah,
is that you're always looking for what's more fundamental than this practice or this artifact, or you know what I mean, the reason behind why we should hold this meeting or retro. I like that because I don't know. A lot of times I choose the right answer, but I just sort of no.
Yeah, no, that's
but
that's
you
right.
bring out all the facets of it in a really good way.
Yeah, no, that's a good observation, Nancy. You're extremely competent. I'm not just saying that about Nancy in general. I know her. I've known her for years, and she's really good in lean. And I don't mind putting on tape that I'd recommend her for anything you have. I trust her. And the thing is, there are 2 interesting things about this. And I noticed this when I first did training, and that's why I do this so much. So when I first started doing design pattern training, what I discovered was that I had to go deeper in my knowledge about things. And then I just went deeper to talk to them. In other words, there's what I knew intuitively, and there's what I could explain. And as I was forced to explain things, getting closer to my instincts went up. I got better when I explained things I already knew. And then I started realizing then the way to learn, and this is a known thing, Covey talked about this, the way you learn is you teach. So what I have always done is I have this curiosity about why is this working? And I know all models are wrong. Some are useful. How do I be less wrong? But here's the interesting thing that, to be candid, I truly discovered in my Amplo development master classes. So I use Miro boards for that. We do whole bunches of exercises and things. And what I found was, if I had something I wanted to convey, and this is something y'all can do, this is really easy and it's amazing. I've not seen it not work yet. It always works. Dangerous to say that, but I should say it's always worked so far. Okay. I have, say, 5 things I want to convey to people that are about something maybe they know, maybe they don't know. See, now if I ask them to tell me, they're quiet, like y'all are often. People often don't want to, there's a certain scare. Oh, maybe I'm wrong, you know. But what I do is I create Miro boards where on the Miro board, I have a topic and I just ask them, go, fill out what you think. I'm going to look to see, that's not what I want. While I'm talking, I figure I'll find one of these guys. And I'll, here's one actually we did. This was the 7th resistance by roll. And what I did is I asked them, like I would ask them, why do people resist change? I don't tell them, I know, I've got a whole presentation on why people resist change. And people start putting things down and they're kind of anonymous, so there's no fear. But what happens is not just, oh, they know this, they get clearer about it by adding, see, all you do is you click this, do Control C, Control V, and then, something here. And then what we do is we talk together and we make affinity mapping of the stuff. And some people, sometimes you dot vote, not here, but sometimes you dot vote, which is most important. And what's interesting, what we're doing here by letting them convey what they know to me, they're not really teaching me, although actually sometimes they are, as David would attest sometimes. Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. Or I never thought about that. Or sometimes I'm proven wrong. I remember that conversation, David, you told me I was conflating things. And that's not as good as Alan. I looked at it and said, oh, you're right. See, people learn this way. You're taking their instinctual nature and making it explicit. This is why explicit workflow is so important. Years ago, after Dave Anderson and I, he's one of 5 people who co-created Kanban. I didn't co-create it, but there were 5. He was one of them. He and I created Lean Kanban University. I'm no longer affiliated with it. It's now just called Kanban University. I brought the Lean in when I left, the Lean went away, at least in the title. Anyway, after the Lean Kanban conference in Miami in 2009, Lean Kanban kind of started up as a competitor to Scrum. And for whatever reason, Ken and Jeff decided to lambaste us in pre-Agile conference interviews at the Agile conference in 2009. And one of the topics they picked was why it's so bad to have explicit workflow. And the idea was if you have explicit workflow, then people will follow it. And the answer is no, that's not what we're saying. We're saying talk about how you're working, talk about your workflow, get everybody to understand what they're doing. And this idea that you follow explicit is wrong. It's just a reflection of what you're saying is the best way. But it turns out explicit workflow has a lot of advantages. First of all, it makes us bring it to the forefront. People can ask, why do you think that's a good idea? And we learn, we explain, it's a collaborative event. Second of all, if you get a new member and you've got explicit workflow, you don't write it out heavy documentation because you're changing your workflow all the time. Something Ono talked about. You have to be reinventing yourself every 30 days or managers aren't doing their job to have people learn. But explicit workflow enables you to take what you already almost know and make it explicit, conscious. I don't know who said this, but a friend of mine said, you can only teach somebody something that they already almost know. So what we have here is I take what they already almost know and they dump it out, or somebody else dumps out something they already almost knew. And now they know it. And we're teaching people to learn. This is where Miro boards are great. Now notice somebody misses the class. Guess what? They come in on the board, they take a look, they add, they learn, they contribute. This is what's known as asynchronous learning, asynchronous collaboration. Now, this was important before COVID, before work from home, that it's really essential. So it's not just all this stuff I've been talking about. It's how do we train? That's really critical. I am gonna give myself a plug here. Let me show you this. because we are also insane in training. I actually posted something just the other day. I said, if I was to design the worst way to do training, or the way to do training that would cause the most need for consulting and the most additional training, I would have full or half day, 2-day trainings where I tell people what to do. And what you get is that this is like the way Scrum works is you have a 2-day course and then another 2-day course, another 2-day course. The way mine works is, well, that's what this is: 2-day course, 2-day course, 2-day course. Mine is, you do a little bit every week for 8 months. This is the impressive one. People talk about how hard it is to get experience. Well, it sure is when you can only ask questions every 2 months in 2 days. Whereas mine, you can ask 2-3 times a week. Not just from me, but from other people. This is why training's so bad. This is why it takes so long to get good people. It should be, I've been saying it should be a matter of months. Tom Gilb, a buddy of mine, is I think one of the smartest people on the planet. And we started out where he was teaching me. Now we've just gotten to be good friends after 2 years of talking every week. That happens with nice people. I told him, I'm trying to get years down to months. He said, you're really talking days or weeks. And I said, yeah, actually I am, but nobody will believe that. Because you don't have to figure it out. One of the favorite comments I had from a business coach I had years ago, like 35 years ago, he would say, the time is not in getting it. The time spent is in not getting it. You go for weeks trying to figure out that, that's so stupid. I can't believe I didn't think of that. Now you need exposure, but you don't need the struggle. That's a good line, isn't it? You need exposure, but you don't need the struggle. And you could use what you've done in the past. Okay, we still got 15 minutes. I'm having a good time answering some of these, and as you can tell, I like to talk. Oh, that's nice. Yeah, about the anonymous, that you're anonymous. It's really nice. So if you've got fear, I should actually write an article that if you've got a fear company, this is a good way to deal with it because people will speak up. Anything else? Going.
It's also a good way to deal with it if English is not their first language.
Yeah, that's actually, I hadn't even thought
people
about
need
that.
to see it written, and then they can think about it a while.
That is really good. In fact, that works 2 ways. Because you have some level of documentation here. If you need to translate it as an agreed thing, it's easier to do that. And you get somebody. See, people always think, oh, that's a lot of work and all that. Well, that's because people tend to think you need like the development group or some project manager, some high paid. You can get college students for 15, 20 bucks an hour to do rote stuff like that, like translation, to organize boards and things. Now, you got to worry about an NDA maybe, but I don't know they're any less trustful than others.
Good tech writers prefer to do it that way because then they're with the people who have the info and they can get clarifications more easily.
Yeah. It also gives you, some people learn better by reading anyway than by listening. So the laying it out is very important.
Yeah, and some people need time to absorb and react, even if English is their native language. And you don't get their contributions if you only let the fast talkers get in.
Yeah, Susan, that's a really important point where I admit I've kind of forgot about. I remember working for a company once. They bought my company, and I was now on the board of directors. I was the CEO, CTO of the company, and we had this board about 8 people, and they were all sorts of different people. They're all employees of the company. But there was one guy, I still remember him. He was really smart, but he was really quiet. He wasn't intimidated, but I mean, he could say things, but he was just that type. He was just quiet. And we'd all go around, and the rest of us, like me, we'd be vocal and all that. And although we had something funny, we did have a rule: you had to go around the circle. Like, we had this way of going around the circle. You couldn't get an order. And if you did, you put a quarter in the jar. And we use that for parties or something. I remember one day somebody came up, he took out a whole bunch of quarters, threw them in the jar. He says, I am going to speak when I want to. We all laughed. But there was this other guy who didn't talk. And when I can remember the CEO of the company at times would stop things and said, the guy's name was Bev. He said, Bev, what do you have to say? And then he would just quietly start on something, and it was the most brilliant stuff. It was like, oh my God. because he was just sitting back listening and putting the whole thing together. And he was actually facilitating what everybody was saying in his brain. It wasn't his ideas. It was perfect what he said. But everybody else was kind of on their own agenda to do stuff. And Bev was thinking, well, what are we all saying together as a team? He had that skill, but he wouldn't jump out unless you asked him to. And you can do that on these boards as well. So Susan, thanks. That's really an important characteristic. Yeah. Obviously, I was not the guy who put the quarters in, but I was sometimes holding on to the armchair waiting for my turn.
I'm sure you had a roll of quarters standing by.
I might have.
You know,
I probably had bills standing by. David's in one of my classes on the Amplio Amplio Consultant Educators Program, where I'm really taking good consultants and making them better. So he has a lot of experience with me.
Yeah. You know, I was going to say something and now I lost it.
It's okay. Anybody else? I'm looking at the comments here. Yeah, this is a nice point, Yasser. People are much more complex than the systems they work in. Absolutely. It's always a people problem in a sense. It's like you can understand what to do, but getting people to do it's another issue. But it's easier to get people aligned when you have understanding. So I'm not saying understanding is sufficient. I mean, excuse me, I'm not saying this model is sufficient, but this model helps you achieve understanding, which is necessary.
I remember now what I was going to say.
Sure, David, what?
You were talking about how, you know, those folks were talking about how being explicit was a bad thing. But, you know, what exactly are all these working agreements or team working agreements that are now, you know, out there? Because, you know, 30 to 40% of the people really want to be told what to do.
Yeah, they really do. And this is actually what we found out. It's kind of interesting. David and I decided to respond to those accusations and some personal attacks that were given as well. Instead of responding to them and arguing with them, we each wrote an article on what we thought was the big difference between Scrum and Kanban. And what's interesting is we didn't talk to each other about it. In other words, we did not collaborate. He just wrote his, I wrote mine. But what's really interesting is we each picked the number one thing we picked was the same without talking. And what that was to have all agreements be explicit, that visibility of work and the workflow was the most important thing that differentiated Kanban and Scrum. It wasn't flow. It wasn't managing WIP explicitly. It was that we created visibility so then everybody could elaborate and collaborate on it. And if you look at a Scrum board versus a Kanban board, now it's changed a lot, but go back 10 years. See, Kanban boards always had columns. You do this, you do this, you do this, you do this. Now, we don't mean it rotely. You have swim lanes and different ways of doing it. It's not do this, do this, do this, do this. That's what it sounds like, even the way I just said it. It's we have these agreements. What does it take to get to the next level? What does it take to get to the next level? And because we're based on lean, we think there is a workflow that you could come up with. Now, if you're in a complex adaptive system, if you don't think there's any pattern to the work, then the best you can do is, well, it's ready, I'm working on it, I'm done, or I need to validate it. You can't say what you're doing. See, so it isn't, I don't want to take it lightly that there was this belief. The belief goes deep down. And in a Kanban board, you'll have this workflow that's out there, and the board represents it. The board is a reflection of how you're working. It's not what you follow. You don't follow the board. I remember saying this so much when I did Kanban. You don't follow the board. It reflects what you're doing, and you've made it explicit on the board. And somebody, I remember, asked me, well, how do I know if I've got a good Kanban board? Here's my test. You have somebody who knows a bit about product development but doesn't know what you're doing, and they look at the board, and give them 5 or 10 minutes of looking at the board. And if after that, with 5 minutes of you talking to them, they understand what you're doing, you've got a good board. And if they don't, you don't have a good board. You don't get it all up there, but you want to get most of it up there. And in Scrum, you have stories and tasks because there's no belief that there's some workflow that works for getting most everything done. So you look at the two boards, you see quite a difference. Now, a lot of Scrum teams are starting to use Kanban boards inside, and that's good. you can do it. Scrum doesn't prohibit doing it, but there's mental attitude of not doing it.
Al, I think something that ties in your comment about you and the other person picking out that common aspect about Scrum and Kanban, the idea there is that it enables self-organization that is good, not chaotic. And I think that that's in line with a lot of other things that I've read and am hearing these days about how when businesses are better at agile, they become more like a network of.
That's right. And they should be.
Nodes rather than hierarchy. So I think the core element here is something that rather than tell anybody what to do or what structure or any of that kind of stuff, anything that supports self-organization, I guess, is a step in the right direction.
As long as the self-organization is consistent with what works, and you need to have a model so you can correct it.
That's what I mean.
I mean, I know you meant that. I'm just
towards a goal. Yeah,
that's right.
I hear you.
See, this is why you can have practice and results in Scrum, but if you don't have this theory, this model, you can't build, you can't move forward. Plus, there's another thing I was reading. I'm reading this book called Peak, and there's some subtitle. I don't remember. It's about how people are. It's really brilliant, very interesting. And he talks about that if you don't have a model, you can't make a prediction of what's going to happen. And then when whatever does happen, you compare it against your prediction. And actually, Eric Ries talks about this a different way. He talks about how he's gone into companies and they, oh yeah, we know what we're doing. We don't need this startup way stuff and all that. So he doesn't push it on them. He's always just mostly asking questions, but he asked them to write down what they think is going to happen and seal it, put it in an envelope, set it aside. And then after it happens, what they said and what actually happened is quite different. And if he hadn't written it down, he couldn't have got him to understand that they have to course correct, and this is what they're course correcting on. We tend to think what we're doing is right, and we tend to forget where we mispredicted. When you predict, and then you see what happens, see, that is how you use empiricism, but you're using it based on a scientific theory of things.
Yeah.
And this is where
I know what you mean.
This is where what Einstein's saying. Now, here's an interesting side effect, because I'm going to talk to something Yasser said about how it's always the people. I had a very interesting insight about 3 months ago. I wrote some post about how I could predict very often what I should be doing or what a team should be doing. And I never tell them what I figured out, but then I ask them questions and guide them to it, because I don't want them to believe me. I want to believe their own experience. And if I just tell them, they'll probably do it, but then it'll fail because they won't have thought through it. They won't resist it. This idea that people resist what you tell them is just wrong. I'm sometimes told I better tell them. And in a consulting engagement, I won't, because I know what'll happen. I know they'll do it, but they'll miss some things. And then they'll blame me, and they'll be right because I shouldn't have told them. So I make them go through it and figure it out by asking questions. I know what's going on based on the principles. But I noticed something when this guy asked me, how right was I? And I thought I went back through dozens of cases I can remember. And this is weird. I noticed that when I came up with something for the very first time that had never been done before, that was even breaking the rules, the practices, not the principles. Like sometimes we should do this according to the principles, but the practices tell us this. Well, I'm going to go with the principles. I remember doing this several times. Mm-hmm. And 100% of the time I did that, it worked. And when I'd been there before, it was about a 75%, maybe a little higher, but about a 75%. Now that doesn't make any sense. I noticed that. Wait a moment, I'm in a more unknown space and I always get it right. Doesn't make any sense when I'm in a known space and I sometimes get it wrong. Yeah, I see the puzzles. Look, Nancy, I had that too. I thought about it. I said, okay, so it's not the known unknown. That's the issue. Something else is different. So I thought about that. I said, oh, yeah. In the unknown, these people were desperate for an answer. Oh. They would do whatever I told them to do. They knew they had a problem. They weren't figuring it out. I couldn't figure it out according to the known things. But in the known situation, there were always experts there who knew what to do. And were resisting what I was saying. We're resisting to learning. So that goes back to, Yasser, what you said. It's the people that finding what to do is not the problem. See, I'm not saying, I want to be very clear about this. I'm not saying that if you find what to do, you solve the problem. No. But I'm saying if you don't find what to do, you definitely haven't solved the problem. Right. And if you know what to do, you can get people to move easier because there's understanding that wasn't there before. And that's why I'm so passionate about this. Because I'm not talking about my own experience. What I've been around 23 years in Agile, okay? It's not the experience of other people. How many companies? Okay, I've worked with a few hundred companies in 23 years. I've talked to maybe several hundred more at conferences. I must have done at least 200-300 conferences in 23 years. But I talk to those people. They have 10, 20, 50, 100 experiences. And what I've seen are these patterns across literally thousands. See, I'm good at this. I'm good at consolidating. Okay, maybe I haven't done it scientifically. I will agree. But I didn't have time to do it scientifically. I've listened, I've talked, I've found the patterns. And it's not right. All models are wrong. Some are useful. I'm trying to be less wrong. But the consistency I've seen, and I would say this goes up and down every method I've seen. I've seen successful Scrum. I've seen successful SAFe. I've seen success everywhere. The common denominator is it was either an easy problem where the company already had it together, or they added lean flow or theory of constraints to it. Every time.
And
they
sometimes
understood what was going on. Yeah, at times waterfall works, but I wouldn't bet on it.
By accident.
Oh. Yeah, sometimes you get lucky. Even there, I would say you do better for a variety of reasons, but yeah.
Yeah, it's different.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to close it now because it's 11:28. Yeah, it's different. It's like, but anyway, thanks for hanging in. I like this conversation. I hope it was useful. I'm having a good time here myself. And I'll get this up. I'm going to have the recording up on the Amplio Community of Practice next couple days. I've got some other work I've got to do. This will then be made available through a registration site in about 30 days, but it doesn't cost anything to go for the Amplio Community Practice. That's on the site. Thanks, and feedback's always welcome or suggestions. Take care.